And there we go. And welcome to the second of a series of 9 webinars this week as part of Circular Cities Week New York, the Inclusive Circular City series. My name is James George. I'm a strategic advisor to Pixera Global, and I'll be your moderator and host for today's session. I'm joined live from in person in Amsterdam with Tamara, and I'll let her introduce herself in a moment, and then online also from Amsterdam, but in a different location. Arjan from the city of Amsterdam. We were due to have 2 other participants with us today who are currently MIA, one for known reasons, one for not, but rest no fear, we still have a good conversation for you today around looking at inclusive circular cities in Europe and trying to understand, actually, if we think about circular economy, we think about the maturity of the concept. Is Europe somewhere that the rest of the world can look to understand some of the challenges and the solutions that have already been created and overcome, and how can we get there faster? But I guess you've got to start as well with why cities? Well, the UN says that by 2050, almost 2/3 of us will live in cities and mega cities. Oh, we've just been joined by Ariel as well. Ariel, good afternoon. I'm just halfway through the introduction, so I'll come to you in a moment. I hope you can hear us all right. We'll push on regardless. So yeah, 2/3 of us living in cities by 2050. And cities present a really great model, a really great opportunity to look at how we implement the circular economy. How do we use that model where there is the potential to control flows of materials in and out of that relatively closed but leaky system as a way to design new and innovative models for the future, for the cities we already have and the cities we're yet to build? Bit of housekeeping really quickly. We're going to, over the course of the next 45 to 60 minutes, get stuck into this conversation with my 3 experts that are surrounding me. But if you want to get engaged in the conversation today, you can. We're all used to sort of Teams and Zoom these days, but if you go to the bottom of your screen, there's a chat box. You can put your questions into that, and the team behind the scenes will feed those to me as we're talking, and we can get you into the conversation. Also, if you want to join in with the conversation through the chat, feel free to put your comments in as our panelists are talking. I'm going to come to you first, Arjan, if I can, from the city of Amsterdam, and just give the stage to you to introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about your work and set the scene a little bit when we think about this concept and the concept of cities in Amsterdam.
Thank you very much, James, and thank you as well for the opportunity to tell something from the city of Amsterdam. Small introduction on myself. I've been working on circularity for around 5 years now. First, I did for the regional government, the province of North Holland, where Amsterdam is situated. And there I developed the first regional circular economy strategy. And over the last 4 years, I've been working at the city of Amsterdam. In Amsterdam, we've embraced the donut. I'll tell a bit more about that in a second, which now is the core, the heart of our circular economy strategy. I've been working on that over the last years and currently working on a few circular economy projects. In Amsterdam, we are working on a monitor that monitors all the flows of materials that go in, through and out of the city. I think we will talk about that a bit more. Tamara also knows a lot about that from Metabolic. And I'm working on a circular legislation tool with the team, which is also quite interesting, but I think today we're mainly talking about more the inclusivity part of circular economy, which is also why I will focus on in my story. Do you want me to go straight forward to my
yeah, please,
my slides? Yeah. Okay, cool. All right, you should be seeing this right now.
Yep.
Cool. Here we are. So Amsterdam's journey towards an inclusive circular economy. This is currently our running strategy, and it's running from 2020 to 25. So we're working hard on it. We have an execution, action, and innovation program running underneath it to actually achieve our goals. We've been working on circular economy in Amsterdam for about 7 years now. We started in 2014, 2015. And initially we started mainly on waste and recycling, but over the years we've been focusing more and more on the front side of circular economy. So more the design side. How can we develop a city so that we reduce waste, and we don't have to think at the end part of it, like what we're going to do with all this stuff. And also development over the years is that we've been trying to approach circularity from a more holistic way. So our current circular aim is actually formulated here as a thriving, regenerative, and inclusive city for all citizens while respecting the planetary boundaries, which is quite broad. These are our concrete objectives. In 2030, we want to move towards a 20% reduction of primary resources. In 2050, we want to be 100% circular and climate neutral city, which is in line with the goals of our nation, of the Netherlands. We also have some interim objectives as a city. Like this year, we want to move towards 10% of the city's procurement being circular. Sounds like a bit of a low aim, but it's very hard as a city we found to actually move towards more procurement. And in 2023, we want all tenders in the built environment to be circular. So at some point, we just wanted to also with the ambitious government board in Amsterdam, they actually decided to move towards to move circularity beyond just material. So the question was how to do this, how to make the transition more social, more inclusive, but also how can we understand better how we relate to a global ecosystem as a city. So how do we affect planetary boundaries and also people, or global social effects? But also, how do we find synergies between city targets and projects and between different siloed domains? So that's how 3 years ago, 2019, we were looking for actually a model that we could actually start implementing and operationalizing on a city's level. And then we met Kate Rayward, a scientist from Oxford University. And at that time, in the years before, her new model gained a lot of attention, which is called the donut economics model. And we started collaborating. So we started experimenting with this model on the city's level. And what you see on the left side is the donut. On the inside of the donut, you see what's called the social foundation. So you can actually color all these different elements. And if it's not completely filled, it means there's a shortfall, which means there's something is lacking to actually realize a thriving community. And on the outer ring, you see the planetary boundaries. So if there's too much of, for example, energy consumption in not a sustainable way, there's an overshoot on these planetary boundaries. So the elegance, I think, of this model is that it brings together a lot of complex elements into one model. And then because it says like, okay, you have the actually aim for us as a city or a nation is, for example, to arrive at the safe and just space for humanity. So that we organize our society and our economy in a way that we can arrive at thriving communities, but at the same time that we don't overshoot so that we trespass the planetary boundaries. So this model we use on a project level, on a strategy level, on an area development level, for all kinds of different ways how we use this model. And this is our first, based on data, the first what we call selfie of our city, the city portrait. And you can see that some data is not available yet, was not available yet 2 years ago. We're still improving this model. And you can see like a lot of Western cities that we are trespassing the planetary boundaries by a lot. Our footprint is way too high as a city. On the inner ring, as the Western European city, Amsterdam, we're doing quite well. on the social foundation. So our job is really to work on these, to maintain this and still improve, of course, the social foundation, whereas at the same time operate much better within the planetary boundaries. And that raises a lot of questions, like how do you achieve that as a city? Well, I'm going to just show some pictures of the process towards this new strategy, because in 2019 we've been working a lot together with Kate Rayward and a lot of different departments and stakeholders in the city towards this new, more holistic, inclusive strategy. And well, we did so by debate evenings with engaged citizens, which we call city makers. And that was a really nice process. So there's always a part of your population in the city that is always wants to be part of what's happening, think along with where the cities go. And Pakhuisberg is this place where a lot of these people come together. And we really, we spend a lot of time debating with them on how to proceed. But also here we see over 100 partners or organizations who were here thinking along in a day-long session in the Zuiderkerk, the South Church in Amsterdam, to think along on how to develop strategies for a new circular economy strategy. And well, we asked also to them, like, how does your organization contribute towards the vision of the circular Amsterdam within the donuts? But also on a grassroots level, together with locals in neighborhoods, we developed a method that we called donut deals, where locals were invited to create local projects which contained, for example, 2 or 3 elements of the social foundation of the inner ring and 1 or 2 elements of the planetary boundaries, so that we get to more donut with 2 projects with the donut nature that are more holistic in their approach. Well, we organize donut workshops at schools, you can see with the children, and there was there was a launch of the civil movement. It's called the Amsterdam Donut Coalition, which is this was like 2 or 3 years ago, and it's grown a lot with a lot of organizations involved. Also, we invite the market to help, and we have different websites such as Innovation Partners, where we ask the market. Well, we have a lot of questions and challenges still as a city to move towards a more circular city, and we are putting the challenges in the market. We invited startups and scale-ups to come with solutions, and they become in-house. We call this startup in residence. They become part of the organization temporarily, and we guide them for half a year, and then we try to operate as a city as a launching customer, so that we help them scale up and grow. But also partners like Metabolic are super important. We are all the time working on creating like a thriving circular innovation ecosystem. And we are very happy with partners like Metabolic, because Amsterdam over the last 10 years almost has been like a hub where the whole concept of circular economy has been developing. It's a lot of thought leaderships from many different organizations. So we feel super blessed as a city that we have this kind of organizations in the city, because the innovative things we try to do, it's a product of a network of different organizations actually. So we happily use that, and we also try to stimulate that by, for example, also giving a lot of new challenges to and opdracht, assignments to, for example, Metabolic, like innovative assignments, so that they can start working this out and developing more, and that a lot of knowledge is also accumulating more and more in organizations like Metabolic. So this is how, and they teach us things again, and this is like a reciprocal, synergetic relationship that we have as public-private, and this I really like, and it's a really nice way of working together, and I think it produces a lot of new knowledge and insights and innovation. So that's it. A few slides for now.
Brilliant. I mean, I've got hundreds of questions that I probably want to ask you, but I'll say this. I want to leave you with three just to kind of think about that. I want to come back to you. You mentioned you started with waste, and I think that's kind of pretty normal for most, right? It seems like the most accessible way to get into the conversation. You mentioned procurement was harder, and I want to come back to that. And then I guess the bit that dawned on me a little bit in there was when you think about the complexity of systems change, how do you, when you're engaging at the community level, and I don't mean this kind of disparagingly, but how do you take those complex challenges, those complex theories, and articulate them in a way that everyday folks can get involved in? And if you've got questions, and one's just popped in actually into the chat, do you get engaged as the talkers go? I'm going to come to you next tomorrow, because I think it was a nice segue with Arjan finishing there, and throw it over to you to talk about metabolic. Let me bring your slides up whilst you sort of start to introduce yourself.
Sure, I'll start with that. Hi, it's very nice to be here. My name is Tamara. I am the Director of Consulting at Metabolic, and over the last year, I've been focusing lots of my efforts on cities and the built environment. There we go. And I'll share some thoughts on our approach quickly, and then looking forward to hearing more from the rest of you as well. So landing the circular economy in cities. James has already said it. We all know the stats. Cities are growing, and we've been fueling that growth with, through this extractive linear economy, taking lots of resources, having these vast, long, intransparent supply chains, and then wasting a lot. And that's causing lots of negative impact elsewhere. So cities far extend their footprints, and that is causing these impacts outside of their administrative boundaries, often affecting already marginalized communities most heavily. So we need to come up with a different system, one in which we, like Arjan mentioned, live within the planetary boundaries. So how can we keep these cities within the planetary boundaries and at the same time provide enough resources for everyone and distribute them in a just and equitable way? So that requires a systems transformation and change on all different, or a lot of different levels. Think about how to bring nature into the city, or think about new mobility systems, or jobs, food. If we want to change that, we need everyone on board. So really activating the ecosystem and all the stakeholders in it. So this is something that Metabolic is working on. We are also an ecosystem of organizations working with governments, businesses, NGOs, and academia to drive systems change, not only for cities, but also on other transitions. And our global mission is to transition that whole economy to a more sustainable future. But today, more about cities, and I wanted to briefly state two ways that we've been working around that, or on that. One started in Amsterdam, our hometown, and was also in collaboration with the city government. So we started out with this brownfield together with lots of partners, architect, landscape architects, but also utilities and community members and organizations. And we wanted to bring the circular economy in practice. So this is, I think, started out almost 10 years ago. And we wanted to make the most circular working environments. What we did is we brought these old houseboats on land and set out to not only create this environment working where we could showcase what the circular economy looks like, but also create a community of local entrepreneurs working together, and at the same time cleaning the place up to leave it better than we got it. So this is what it looks like today. You see all these houseboats, there's 14 of them, they're exchanging energy. We have an aquaponics greenhouse, we have a restaurant on site, and there's lots of different entrepreneurs trying circular solutions out. And there's lots to learn there. So if you bring things into practice through bottom-up experimentation, or have an experimental zone in a city, it's a really good opportunity to share knowledge and showcase what a circular economy could actually look like. It's great to learn, understand what kind of rules and policies are there in a city, but also getting into conversations on how to create new ones or influence. Think about how we can do that differently. And it helps test new technologies, and these don't always have to be high tech, right? It doesn't always need to be innovation, but it can also be things that have already existed for a long time. And it can be a catalyst for its surrounding neighborhoods. So what we saw here in the north of Amsterdam is that we started with the Keuvel, the Living Lab, and that around that, lots of pockets of new initiatives started flourishing. Now, from the Keuvel, from that experimentation, we've really scaled up our cities work, going from building levels, but also now working with lots of neighborhoods and cities globally. Lots of cities in Europe, but we're now also partnering up with Pixera in the US on quite a couple of cities, including Cleveland. But I wanted to use the example of Krakow to kind of highlight what kind of approach we take. So this was a project that we ran 2 years ago, in which we had 3 Polish cities and we developed circular economy strategies in tandem. So we worked with local partners to make sure that we work with the existing groups of stakeholders already working in that space, and that we really build on existing programs as well. So what our approach is that we try to really understand the city first. So thinking about the natural ecosystem, but also the history and its culture, thinking about the built form, but also, like I was saying, including the finance mechanisms, talking about the programs, EU endeavors that are already in place, and then working with partners on the ground and companies, entrepreneurs that are already in this space as well. So getting a good image landscape analysis of what is there, then getting together with different driving groups to shape a vision, where do we want to go, and also make sure that that's measurable and that it has clear targets, like the one that Arjen was mentioning, that the city of Amsterdam has as well. And then we want to get to action, because that's the most important thing, right? We can build reports, but that's not what we want to do. We want to really drive action. So what we did in Krakow is we highlighted 24 actions to kickstart the circular economy. And the idea is that they can be proven solutions. We make sure that we highlight which stakeholders to engage in them. They should impact the vision, and they should also, we also assess them on how feasible they are. So we try to look at like what is impactful, but also what can we land, and preferably tomorrow. And then this is an example on zero waste public institutions and schools. So we had lots of resources on where to look for inspiration, so that we make sure that we don't lose all the knowledge that has been already aggregated in different cities. And we try to plan it into time as well. And then we link it to existing policy frameworks, but also try to highlight financial mechanisms and how to bring all of that together. And then for this, in this particular case, we also try to make it spatial, because a city is not one whole, it's made of different neighborhoods. So there's also different ways of landing certain solutions in different neighborhoods. Just a couple of learnings from that approach is that cities are at different points of readiness, right? Like there's all these different factors in place that will influence the way that we work with cities. It's so important, again, emphasizing to build on local initiatives and facilitate them in their journey as much as possible. And then also each neighborhood can have a different role in achieving these citywide goals. And last but not least is that getting insights into where the city is through accessible data is something that we really value. I'll leave it at that, because I can talk about this forever.
Yeah, and we'll get into it a little bit.
Exactly.
I guess similar to Arjen, like, yeah, thank you. A couple of interesting points you pulled out there. I think when I think about Koval, you said that 10 years ago. When we think about circular economy today, it's a lot more mainstream than it was 10 years ago. So it strikes me that when we think about normalizing some of these behaviors, some of these new opportunities, that's a real challenge when we think about disruptive business models, different ways of living, different ways of interacting with the city itself. I imagine that was a completely different challenge 10 years ago when you took these boats and put them onto the land and then convinced people to live in them. But we can get to that. And I did like that bit about kind of building reports, getting to action. And I guess to all the speakers today as well, I think that it comes across really clearly that this is a complexity beyond complexities when we think about cities. And your point there towards the end about regionalization within the city itself, it is a landscape, a map of a tapestry of different cultures, social economic mobility. And I think there's something really strong here around replicating solutions rather than just scaling one solution across everything. I'll be keen to get into that when we think about inclusivity. Moving last but not least then to our final speaker, Dr. A. Good afternoon, from Arup, and Ariel is the team leader for cities in Arup. So I'm going to throw over to you for your opening gambit.
Yes, thank you so much. And let me just introduce myself before I'm showing up some visuals. My name is Ariel von Richthofen. I lead the cities team for Arup Germany in Berlin. I work on topics such as smart cities and circularity. in particular mapping urban mining and urban harvesting potentials using AI. I have more than 15 years of academic experience. I worked in Switzerland, the US, the Sultanate of Oman, and Singapore before relocating to my hometown, Berlin. I kept my academic ties as a co-investigator in various research projects with ETH Zurich, University of Cambridge, and the National University of Singapore on topics such as circular future cities and also cities knowledge management systems. So what I wanted to share is really just some food for thought. And I find myself in a very illustrious group of people that have a lot to say from the practice and from academia. So I just want to point to this webpage, the Arab Germany webpage. We're celebrating our 30 years, so we collected 30 ideas. And sustainability is really at the core of what we want to do. So I just want to flag things that deal with circularity. Together with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, we came up with this circular buildings toolkit. So this is, I think, a really valuable resource for anybody interested in circularity and cities. And it looks like this. It's a framework. You have a guide how to use the framework. You can see various strategies, for instance, actions, reuse, renovate, or maybe don't build at all. You have a collection of case studies, which is a growing library where you can get inspiration. And you also have a collection of tools where you can see our Arab in-house tools that we share, but also other resources that help you get your head around circularity. And what I like the most, it's actually a social platform. So you can add your own project, and then you can showcase your project here as well. So it's really meant to be a sharing platform. Now I need to see if I can move the control bar. Yes. Another thing that I want to highlight is we saw the necessity as a consultancy firm, engineering and consultancy firm, to help our clients on the path to decarbonization. So decarbonization is an important aspect of reaching the sustainability goals. One could say the circularity is another one. They're not directly related, but of course, if you save materials by reusing it, you're also reducing your carbon footprint. So this is a tool that we developed that can monitor your real estate assets. And by extension, you can also monitor neighborhoods in cities. Of course, it all hinges on the data that you provide, but you can see if you're on track in your sector, in your neighborhood, in meeting the decarbonization goals. And then, because I lead the cities team, we also work on actual city projects. So this would be one for the German city of Heidelberg, where we rethink the former military village to design it into a new part of that city. So this is just some food for thought. There are more resources on our website. We often give ourselves some tasks, like we think what could be a green building, a green city. So we think through this idea of green building envelopes. So we have this growing library of ideas that we really put out there. Of course, they also serve to attract potential customers, but they're also resources for others to share and discuss with. So that brings me to the end of my presentation, and I'm really keen on discussing with you on the topic of circularity at the city scale. And I already see a lot of interesting things in the chat, but maybe I'll hand over back to you, James, and see how we take it.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for the introduction, and that was pretty punchy, which is good. I guess that also leads to another point, which a couple of things that come in the chat. We will, after today, share as many of the assets and links as we can. Anna, if you want to drop me a note, if you can, through the chat to let me know how we're going to do that specifically. But I think we'll get this information to you. I'm right in thinking as well, the stuff you just showed on the ARAP website, that's all open source, right? Anyone can access that and access.
Anybody can access that. I'll post the link here. I don't want to spam anybody, but I think it's really interesting resource, and it's actually funded by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. So it's meant to be shared. It's for the the joint and ambitious goal of making this world a little bit better and a bit more sustainable. Yeah.
Amazing, thank you. So we've heard the opening gambits here from our three panelists. We were meant to have a fourth today, who was Fernanda from Enel, but unfortunately couldn't make it today because of personal circumstance. But one of the bits that I wanted Fernanda to bring was the topic of energy into this conversation. And we've had a couple of questions already started to come in. I want to start to all of you actually with a couple of these questions as a nice way to kick off, because the conversation is understandably very European focused here, and there's a very strong Amsterdam flavor to the topic so far, given where we're located and also where the 2/3 of our speakers are focusing on. But this question comes in from our friend Peter from Enel North America. How is Amsterdam, or the Netherlands as a whole, guiding energy policy to enable a circular transition? Energy supply is liberalized, i.e. choose your own supplier. But it seems renewables are still far behind fossil fuels as a percentage of total generation mix. Has this been a focus in the discussion of circularity? So I'm just going to, who wants to go first and take a crack? Tamara?
I mean, I was gonna say maybe Arjan, since he's representing the municipality of Amsterdam, but I can also say something about it. But I think Arjan, if you want to take a first.
Yeah.
So just to paraphrase it again, it's about the question of fossil fuels and versus renewables. That
yeah. So how is Amsterdam guiding energy policy to enable circular transition, given that energy supply is liberalized, as you can choose your own supplier, and that renewables seem far behind fossil fuels as a percentage of total generation mix? So I guess for me that feels like, how do you make sure that choice is balanced and not biased by the fact that the industry is weighted towards what was historically fossil fuels?
Well, first of all, Peter is well informed. It's true that in the Netherlands, we are quite behind when it comes to renewables. I think we're quite lagging in Europe. Partly has to do with the fact that we are one of the most populated areas of Europe. So it's quite hard to find space for windmills, for example, and solar panels. We're building a lot of windmills at sea, offshore at the moment, but we're still lagging. And that's something I'm not very proud of. I think we should have been much further. When it comes to the different transitions, we see the energy transition as a separate transition, and the circular economy as a separate transition. Circular economy actually focusing on materials. And what we are trying to, with new data, trying to gain new insights in is also when you look at the CO2 emissions of the city, how do scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions relate? So scope 1 emissions are the emissions that are really occurring in the city itself. Scope 2 are the emissions that are related to our energy consumption. And scope 3 emissions are actually the emissions that are related to consumption and the use of materials in the city. So scope 3 also looks at the supply chains. And based on our latest data, actually 70 to 90% of all CO2 emissions produced by Amsterdam are scope 3 emissions. So we slowly see also now a shift in awareness, and not in policy yet. We have a new city government, we just had elections. So the question is what they will do with this new insights and information. But we see more and more that the consumption of materials of cities, also food, all kinds of, consumption goods, but also for construction, that's actually the biggest part of our CO2 emissions. So it has shown us even more how enormously important the transition towards a circular economy is. And that if you want to move towards operating within the planetary boundaries, it is like, and also achieve, for example, the Paris Agreement goals, that it is preconditional to actually realize a circular economy.
Yeah, perhaps to build on that, indeed, like what Arjen is saying, that there is more and more insight that consumption-based emissions are indeed a giant leverage point, or a really important point to start with. But I did want to say about Amsterdam, what I think is going really well is the new neighborhoods that are being developed on some of the edges of the city have really clear sustainability or circular economy visions, and those include how energy is going to be generated, right? So I think for lots of these neighborhoods, that's an opportunity to really phase fossil in the built environment out. And then, of course, if you think about the built environment and then the city center of Amsterdam, that might be more difficult to then transform due to its monumental status. We do have a lot of other new endeavors, synergies with data centers, and like a lot of working groups working on that. So I think that's also a way of just kind of moving around these fossil fuels.
Ariel, anything else you'd like to add into that question?
Yes, indirectly. This is just the German perspective. As you know, the Russian invasion in Ukraine just actually challenges the European approach towards energy. And the only positive thing one can see in this is that Europe needs to be more independent and needs to be more on renewables. So this might be a rocky start, but it might actually be just accelerating an ecological transition that was already anticipated. So the good thing is there is a strategy, and if there's a positive outcome from all the strategy, then it is that decision makers have to act, and they will. So this transition towards renewables is going to be faster. Yes, we might see energy prices hiking, but we might also see renewables becoming more competitive than before. If we go back to the built environment, transformation there is rather slow. You know, you can't just exchange your heating system in one season. It's a transformation that you have to anticipate. It depends on larger infrastructure and so on. But for instance, we see the rise of data centers, and we know that they provide a lot of excess heat. And Arab Germany is now working towards capturing that heat and using it to support adjacent neighborhoods. There's a whole challenge there because the heat delta, the temperature delta is not so high. Now, if you have conventional cogeneration plants, the delta is much higher. You have hundreds of degrees difference, and you can use that along the way to heat a lot of different things. And here you have maybe just 50 or 70. But we have heat pumps, we have other ways to kind of redensify the energy and then make it usable. So I would say that we haven't reached the limits yet. You know, the transition towards net zero is super exciting, and no crisis is going to stop Europe from going this way.
Thank you. I want to pivot that a little bit, actually, because I think it's fair to say, and even in this last week, there's been a lot of announcements coming out of the EU around smart cities and selection of smart cities, and this concept of redesigning the cities we have and what are the decisions we take for the cities of the future. And Tamara, you touched on there about energy, renewable energy opportunities on the outskirts of Amsterdam. But one of the things I spoke with all of you about ahead of this was when we think again through this lens around inclusivity. And the bit that I keep coming back to is when we think about topics like gentrification, when we think about new technologies, when we think about retrofitting, and to your point just there, changing out a boiler or changing out a heating system, there's a cost and it also takes time. How do we balance that with the different socioeconomic pressures that we see within our cities, within our municipalities? And what are the ways that you think we can unstick this? One of the comments, one of the questions that came in from Joanna in New York was that she said our city agencies often use community engagement as an excuse to put off necessary action. And how does Amsterdam avoid this? I kind of see that a bit further. How does challenges like cost, location, we touched a little bit about kind of urban mining and materials and stuff. How do these factor into this social aspect when we think about bringing these new technologies and their affordability to everyday folks?
I think it's a very open question. So the first question is community engagement and participation is crucial to get everybody on board. There's a collective intelligence, there's knowledge about the places that cannot be replicated by experts or data. So you have to, and now the next step is, we all know this ladder of participation that can go from tokenism to like full participation. And you can obviously do a pretend participatory process, but that's not going to give you the insights you want. So from my experience working in the German context, and I'm sure that Amsterdam is similar, first of all, these processes are driven by the city administration. So they're driven by democratically elected bodies. They're paid by taxpayers. So there's a responsibility to make this transparent, open, and fair, and inclusive. Does it always work? Does it always represent everybody's opinion? Maybe not, but there is a real effort to include everybody, minorities, people who don't speak, let's say, the main spoken language, but still live there, people who don't have access to internet or other things, young, disabled, everybody has their say. In Berlin, this can be quite brutally honest. It can go that we need security in order to calm down and make sure everybody can attend this and voice their opinion in a safe way. And these processes, as I said, they take time. We see years of participatory processes that may lead to decisions such as no redevelopment. And that leads to more questions like, where are the people going to stay? Berlin is a very attractive city like Amsterdam. And we have an estimated shortage of, 20% of apartments across the city, which leads to price hikes and other undesired effects. So cities are complex things. My takeaway is that you have to address and embrace the complexity. And diversity is one way to make a system more resilient. So if you understand the diversity, if you embrace the diversity, if you allow maybe contradictory things to happen, your system might be off better for future shocks that you can't even foresee. So I think that, participatory processes are really important because they can give a voice to this diversity. They can maybe also show that they're contrasting ideas and they might stop things on the short run, but they might also open up fantastic possibilities for the future that we don't really know. So this was my little speech towards diversity and inclusion.
I was kind of waiting for Arjan.
Yeah, well, no, you go first this time, Tamara.
I was just
looking forward to hearing you.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna touch upon the urgency of this, because we've seen energy prices in Amsterdam and the Netherlands, I think, triple over the last couple of months, and that is, and for people that have no like set contracts, that has led to a price that they can not afford anymore. So the energy transition is really quite urgent. And I think community engagement and making sure that everybody is included in how you want to do that. And I think it doesn't only stop with like heat pumps and getting all the infrastructure in place, but it also starts with like insulating houses, making sure that the living standards is up to date, which then brings the question of like, who's going to do that? Because I think I read an article that said that we in the Netherlands lack about 40,000 people capable of doing this kind of like job, which then, leveling the urgency and then getting the materials in and then making it happen. And then who's going to pay for that? Because sometimes it's an early investment that then leads to a payoff or, in a couple of years. So I think it also comes down to like having accessible funding opportunities, making sure that people are aware of those and then helping them apply to them, right? So that you don't only have this community engagement factor of like, how are we going to take care of our neighborhoods, but also really facilitate individual households or streets or community cooperatives to apply for funding like that and make it happen. So giving, not only engaging them, but also giving them the tools is I guess what I'm getting to. Arjen, do you wanna?
Yeah, well, I think very, very well said by the two of you, and also working with the donut, we see more and more, like before even starting to engage people. If you want to really get the majority of the people to move along into more circularity or sustainability, it requires that they have something to spend, that they have choices to make, for example. And for a lot of people, also what you just said, Tamara, there's more and more pressure on income, and there's less and less to choose. So I think more equality on income and higher basic level of income is also preconditional to move towards more sustainability and more circularity, because as it is now, there's also still only a minority of people who can really make the decision to buy new, innovative, more circular products, which are often, especially in the first stages when they haven't been able to scale yet, quite more expensive, often twice the price. So I think before, it's super important to like a thriving community with a middle class that has like sufficient income to spend. If you don't realize this as a city or as a nation, it's going to be super hard to move to scale up your whole sustainability as a whole. And then when it comes to participation, it shouldn't, I think, also be underestimated how hard it is, how complex it is. It sounds easy, but it is very hard. It requires also from civil servants, it requires empathy, a lot of empathy. It requires letting go of unconscious pre-assumptions, and I think it also needs. So it starts with working on yourself as a civil servant before really starting a participation process. I already hate the word participation process because it sounds so much like a thing, like that you have to do with people. But it's I think super important to really and then start at the very start of a process and not have something ready when you go start talking with people, but just start an open conversation about starting to really understand what situation people are in and what is happening in a certain place in a certain location before you even put your pen on a paper when you're developing something. And I think that's often where it goes wrong, and we still, as governments, we can learn a lot. We've been trying some things over the last years that have worked, like our latest government board has said, like everything you do, every project you start, a policy you make, there has to be a participation paragraph. It sounds horrible, but it was a way of this government to say, like, you cannot, like a financial paragraph, you cannot move your plan to the city council if there hasn't been a participation process trajectory before. So this was a way to try and institutionalize it, and I think it did work with all the flaws, of course, of it. But I think it did realize more participation. We've been lately, like half a year ago, there's been mini burgerberaad. It's called mini civil deliberation, which was quite a well-organized process where citizens were invited to think along for climate solutions in the city. First, they had like a little course on in which they got a lot of facts, and so that they really understood the situation, and then they could formulate recommendations. And those recommendations were offered to the city council. So they didn't go into the municipal bureaucracy, but those recommendations were really offered to the city council. And so then the democratic process could take its place. And then afterwards, a lot of the people who participated, they actually said they wanted to stay involved also in the execution of the plans of the recommendations they did. So that's something that we learned a lot from, and it worked out quite well. So we're having several of this kind of more democratic process. Also, for example, how to spend budget in certain neighborhoods. So we're experimenting. Yeah, we're experimenting with it, but it's always a super big challenge to truly organize a participation. Long answer.
Yeah, no, but it's good work because I'm hearing lots of things come out of there. But I guess the really important thing here, which comes across really well, is this idea of communicating and consulting. Right, this isn't about creating these solutions in isolation. It is about taking that human-centered design, even if that human-centered design looks and feels very differently region to region within your city. Like there are hyperlocal factors that you need to take into account to take everyone along. I wonder then, there's a question in the chat, and I think Aurelio, you were starting to type an answer to it. Technology, and this is an oversimplification through my words. You mentioned AI as part of the work with Arup and using it as a mechanism. Is technology the answer? Is that the way to kind of limit some of these costs?
So technology, I see technology as something situated between science and culture, or science and society. So technology is something that we have been using, we as human race, as civilization have been using for thousands of years. And yes, it helps us achieve certain things, but it's not the answer in itself. So I'm not a techno-utopist who would say that once we have developed, let's say, the perfect AI that can govern it all responsibility will be handed over to that system. I think that we are at a super interesting crossroads though. AI, and this is it's a buzzword, and maybe we'll see, we won't use it in a few years anymore. But to give you a concrete example, we hardly know the material composition of our built environment. We don't know it. We're surrounded by buildings that are old. And even if they're not so old, just 5 years, in very few cases, people have put on a public database of the material composition of their buildings. The building I'm sitting in is probably 10 years old. But if I were to look online for a source, what it's made of, I wouldn't find any information. But looking at it as an architect, I could say that building probably contains a lot of concrete and steel, a bit of glass, a few lines of copper, quite a bit of plastics. So if I have the information about that, and if I would know when it was built and when it's going to be renovated and maybe refurbished and maybe demolished, I could know when the materials would go back into the loop. And a big challenge with construction materials is that they're heavy, dirty, and that they don't have any value. The biggest problem is that we have lost the information about the actual value of those materials, because if you want to put up a building like this, it's going to cost you a lot of money. So there was a value. So here, technology, and I'm just using 2 simple examples, AI can help you recognize the material composition at a large scale. You can automate this. You can have a drone flying over the city, you can use satellite images, and the AI system can give you an estimate of where the material is. It doesn't have to be super precise. You just want to have a ballpark figure, because that's going to allow you to adjust your policies. Like if you don't have any wood, why would you have a circular framework to recycle it? If you know that asbestos is not a problem anymore, you also don't need to factor that in. But the material composition of the built environment can be thought of as a fingerprint or as the material DNA of cities. And if you take that analogy, you would immediately know that it matters to know the DNA in order to have a cure for a problem. So AI here is a technology that can speed up processes we could do manually. We could also have surveyors walk across the cities of Berlin. It would take them 10 years to complete, and then they could start all over again. Yeah. That's not the speed we need. We need like now. And that's where AI comes in. Blockchain has been talked about a lot. I think the idea of material passports, such as linking that information to blockchain allows you to trade it into the future. So you would have information that somebody would enter in the system now, and maybe the use of that information is only down the road, somebody else. But blockchain would be a way in order to monetize it and in order to incentivize people to enter that information and also to secure it. So these are just some examples where technology comes in. And of course, then you have the drones and satellite images and the GPS, the possibilities, and the near frequency radio technology and so on can actually help you give things that otherwise don't speak a lot, like buildings or materials or components, the way to tell a story about themselves. And that information is super valuable. I could go on, but just think about technology as an intermediary between data, which is on one science and data, and society and as humans on the other side. Yeah, so very important.
It's really interesting, right? And I think back to a couple of reports that Eric did a few years ago around principles to practice in the built environment. And actually, we all know that the built environment supply chain is heavily disrupted, heavily distributed. And those different parties don't talk to each other. And one of the big kind of things that came out from that was not that folks didn't want to make the right choices and try and access this material. It's just that there wasn't communication between the different elements, which meant the material wasn't recovered in time. And I think that's where I think things like, or it feels like things like AI and better data insight rather than just data collection allows us to predict that into the life cycle of a building. I want to pivot a little bit if we can. We've got about 10-15 minutes left and we've still got a few questions coming in. We've talked a lot about the built environment. We've talked a lot about energy. We've talked a bit about people in the communities and how we bring it forward. I want to pivot for a moment to food. And specifically when we think about the design of our future cities and, you know, the advancements in hydroponics and vertical farming. And I guess the concepts of urban farming, peri-farming. Samara, I'm sure you touched this quite a lot with your work. How is that factored into the discussion when you think about Amsterdam, but also when you looked at Poland as well?
Yeah, food. Food is a tricky one because we need it, but we're also having a growing population, and the food system that we've built in order to never be hungry again is incredible, but it's also crossing a lot of these planetary boundaries. It's taking up a lot of land, and we are probably producing things that we shouldn't be producing as well, and getting these food products from places that that are really quite far away. So we do get, food is always like when we do this integral analysis for a city, food is always, of course, one of the analyses that we do. We look at biomass, we look at what the food system looks like. We just recently did a scan for the region of Guelph Wellington in Canada, and they were looking to become the most circular food region of the world. But then you get into lots of issues, right? Because this is a region, it has an administrative boundary, but the majority of the food actually comes from elsewhere. And that's when you get into the impacts associated with these supply chains, right? Like, so what do I have agency over as a city, right? Like, what can I influence? And how can I provide the guidelines for more local food production, or what can we do locally? And I think that's a really interesting question. Also bringing it back to the Netherlands, where we have this giant, we have lots of greenhouses and we have a lot of food production. We're one of the biggest food exporters of the world, whereas, like Arjen said, we're also very heavily populated and a very small land surface. So there's lots of opportunities there, but I think it also really comes to the kind of the core question, like, what do we need? Like, what do you want to do with these food production centers? Do you want to produce food for your local cities, or can we, or do we want to export? And then what are we eating? What is our diet? So that's like with food, it really also comes down to what is our diet? Like, should we be eating the amounts of meat that we're consuming, or should we scale that back? Or should we have access to avocados all year round? Like, so it really comes down to the diet as well, and then creating a vision of that food food future together, and kind of agreeing on what we envision for that. We haven't really, or my colleague Chris, actually, he did a food vision for Amsterdam, but I was not involved in that. So I can't really speak to Amsterdam, but perhaps Arjan, you can.
Yeah, well, like food, yeah. I think when you look at food from a circular perspective, I think it's one of the best, most obvious examples where technological and social transition comes together. And it really is like, on one hand, you can say like there's a lot of potential solutions, like vertical farming, plant-based burgers, cultured meat, all these kind of things, and that might lead to well, less impact. But at the same time, you want to change consumption patterns, of course. And I think especially in the latter, as a city, we might have some influence. So we don't have a lot of influence when it comes to regulatory instruments and stuff as a city in the Netherlands. But we're close to the people, so that's where we can actually do things. We have recently launched our first city monitor, which shows how materials flow in, through, and out of the city. And we also compare to different sectors and material flows. And we were quite surprised that food was having such a relatively high impact when it comes to CO2 emissions, but also on other environmental effects. And we actually found that it was, after when we looked at it closely, we found it was quite logical because it has such a high rhythm in the city. Like when you're building materials, they come into the city and you fix them for 100 years or longer, if you do well. But food comes in such high volumes because every day, like tons of foods are coming into the city and being consumed. So it's really, it also has our bigger focus and attention now. We're working together with the regional governments, the provinces, who are now putting circular agriculture, kringloop landbouw, we call it, high on the agenda, in which, cooperation with farmers is set up. Like, how can you, for example, one of the biggest problems is that we are importing a lot of artificial fertilizer from all kinds of the world, which causes a lot of problems in our ecosystems, eutrophication, so too many nutrients in the system, and all kinds of bad side effects. So work together with farmers to see how you can actually get to closed loop or shorter loop systems in the agriculture itself. And of course, we're also looking at short chains and how we can stimulate that. But short chains are not always the answer when it comes to environmental effects, because sometimes you see that long distance transport can be more effective than short. The way our system is organized now can have fewer environmental impacts and CO2 emissions than doing a lot of movements in the short distance, for example. So this is quite a complex system as well that we're still retrieving a lot of data on. So just a few perspectives on food. It's big. It has a lot of impact, and it has a lot of dimensions.
No, thank you again. I'm not undermining the complication and the complexity of a topic like food, and I guess water as well to the same extent, right? Just really quickly before we move on to the next sort of topic, but did food feature in the Koval model? Because you talked about kind of cooperative energy. Did it also come in with some of that hyperlocal?
Yeah. So we have a really cool kind of case study, or we have a program around our own aquaponics greenhouse. So we have a functioning greenhouse. We're testing all these new technologies and software out to optimize it and see how you could actually scale that up in a neighborhood. And it's a really nice example of what a circular economy could look like in a food system in a city. So we have a restaurant on site that uses the produce that is grown in the aquaponics greenhouse, which is a closed loop system with fish that provide the nutrients needed for the crops to grow. And then the food waste, and I think the boat is not active right now, but we had a biogas boat that would then make gas for the restaurant to cook on from the unavoidable food waste coming from the cafe. So I think that's a really nice way of like bringing these smaller loops and and the circular economy, quite frankly, into practice in high density neighborhoods. Yeah.
I guess the challenge I see when you think about just the breadth and spread of cities is that scaling is really difficult, and actually sometimes it is about replicability rather than scale. I wonder though, where does policy support or hinder the implementation of new ideas? I guess there's a bit about normalization and it becoming just front and center of the consumer, front and center of the population. But then there's a time, and I think, Ajay, you touched on this earlier, and in fact, when is policy a carrot and when is policy a stick? What are your thoughts on the role that policy plays in building our future inclusive circular cities?
Was the question directed to me?
It was, sorry, yeah.
It's a big question.
I thought,
yes.
Arjan and our role, it's a little bit similar. So I thought it was directed to Arjan. Yeah, it is a very big and it's a very open question. What we find, actually, one of the projects I'm working on is a circular legislation tool, which should allow policymakers to make better use of the legislative framework. So all the provisions that are currently in the legislative framework of the Netherlands. So looking at very closely at what kind of authorities do we have, what kind of room do we have, as, for example, as a city, to actually also turn more buttons. Because recently, over the last 1-2 years, from our national advisory boards, it was advised that actually we have to use also the stick more in the transition. It cannot. The transition now is good. It's like it's setting the agenda, but it's too voluntary. So we have to also look how we can use the stick more, and we're looking at that closely. We still see that we have quite a linear legislative framework at the moment, which still doesn't favor circular entrepreneurs, for example. So there are some big buttons that have to be switched in the system on a national level or even a European level. And a lot is also currently in development. So Europe is working on very ambitious circular new legislation that should really, and I also believe that I've seen, for example, the eco-design directive, that is very ambitious, and that is going to, for example, there's something in it, it's called the right to repair for consumers, that all the products have to be developed in such a way that they can be repaired, which is, I think, if the Commission, I think it still has to be adopted somewhere in the coming months. But if they do, that might be a game changer. So that is good. At the same time, I believe it's always very important, also when you use a stick, to combine it with also more facilitating and supportive policy instruments or measures. For example, financial, so that businesses or people are actually able to adapt. So, for example, if you say this is not going to be allowed anymore, this kind of material, for example, in 3 years, that you actually also help the market in getting it there with financial instruments, but also, for example, with knowledge exchange or helping them to innovate to actually get there. So it's always, I think, that it's very important to be very aware of the moment, of the timing of using instruments, but also the way you combine them, for example.
Thank you. We're fast running out of time, and I want to come to you for a couple of thoughts on. I guess we heard there from Arjan around some of the challenges with policy when we think at the kind of the city level, municipality level. But I guess for someone like Arup, working in lots of different global jurisdictions, you must see a wide spectrum of policy that works and doesn't. Are there any kind of elements that you can share where you've seen policy being used as a kind of force multiplier when we think about some of these challenges?
So first of all, Arab is a global enterprise, but I work on the German firm, and we're working in Germany in a very specific context. But the experience that I have from the question of policy is that if we go back to my string of science, technology, and society, you can extend this and say that there's also policy, and policy should reflect what the society wants to achieve. So a policy framework that is well designed is going to enable certain actions. So a policy framework for sustainability and circularity is going to enable just that. It will give people incentives, it will align goals, it will unlock synergies. That's what it's good for. So in the best sense, policy then becomes a law that enables certain things. So we tend to think, or maybe some people think about laws as being restrictive, but I could give you many examples where, let's say, data privacy laws foster a new standard of dealing with data, and that creates a new section of economy which caters just to that. And I think in sustainability, it could be the same thing. A well-drafted policy will, for instance, for the case of Amsterdam, will distinguish Amsterdam from other cities, will make it more attractive for its citizens, but also for its economy. And the price you will have to pay will be offset by the quality of life, by the talent that you get, by the resilience into the future. You have to imagine that we're facing huge changes. And we don't have a choice. We have to become circular as a matter of survival. And the cost of becoming circular late in the game is so high, So a policy framework that anticipates that change is really for the benefit of all of society. What can I say in more practical terms? Germany, for instance, has drafted the so-called New Leipzig Charter, which is a charter for urban development, and which puts the civic society and sustainability at the center. So they just said this has to align. If we want to make cities viable in the future, they have to be for the people and they have to be sustainable. Sounds super simple, but that framework allows companies like Arab to develop new business models. We can consult along these lines. We have cities that request this from us. We're flooded with requests for sustainability studies, climate change mitigation studies, environmental impact studies, you name it. So there's an exciting moment where we can do all of this because there was a policy mandate. And you might have heard about the new European Bauhaus. This is the artistic side of it, but it builds upon this idea of the New Leipzig Charter. And then you might have heard about the European New Green Deal. It's just bringing this to another level at the European level, saying if we want to achieve this, we have to achieve it together. So let's join forces across Europe. And you even extrapolate it further. You could say, well, what is it any good if Europe decarbonizes and becomes circular and the rest of the world doesn't? But I would be surprised how the other economies would align to this. Even big players like China that people say are slow to move, etc. They will take this as a blueprint. They want to be best in class. I was in the chat. I responded to a question that I just want to pick up on my experience in Singapore. And this is just my personal experience. So I've seen how a Southeast Asian country that is very well organized, first world country, is dealing with all of this. And they have their own approach, very technocentric, very meritocratic, very lean. One could even say top down. But they're facing the same challenges. And they're looking at Europe and they say, how can we do this together? All of a sudden, there are synergies between countries that are geographically totally remote and separate, but they understand the same urgency. And Singapore is tiny. I mean, they have a population of 6 million. So what kind of impact would 6 million people do across the global population? Well, it doesn't really matter because there's also economic incentives. Singapore is thriving on this idea that they can develop technology that can be exported, knowledge that can be shared. So this is, I think, is very exciting. Yeah.
Amazing. And that's a great place to end there. I know we could probably keep going, and apologies to those whose questions and comments we didn't get to. As I mentioned before, all of the slides and documentation from today will be shared with you via an email after today. Thank you for joining. Thank you to the three panelists for a great conversation. I've taken a lot away from that, namely, I love that technology is the link between science and society. I'm definitely gonna rip that off. We have to embrace the complexity of cities. Communication is really key in all of these elements, especially when we think about the community and bringing people to the center. And that's my final sort of point here, right? Like when we think about creating the cities of the future, we need to bring community to the heart of the discussion, because whilst there are huge economic volumes of waste, opportunities, actually it's where we live, it's where we work, and that's the really important part. Thank you for listening. Thank you for joining. We've run over a little bit. This was number 2 of 9 of these sessions this week. Later on today, we're going to hear from the team talking about the challenges in Mexico. Tomorrow it's Brazil and Ghana and reimagining New York City. Thursday, we're going to talk about New Delhi and the opportunities in India, the role of private sector, and then Friday, the final hurrah with a number of announcements and bringing together all the tenets of the week. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for taking part. Thank you to our panelists. Enjoy the rest of your day and look forward to speaking to you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.